Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and good evening. My name is Marty Smith. I am a rancher based in north central Florida. You can tell from the slide here, the town or the community is Wacahootie. You probably will not find that on the map, and I think we're probably satisfied to keep it that way. That is a Seminole word for cow pen, and my family's been ranching there for what is now coming up on 170 years. Not to say we've been any good at it, we've just lasted a long time. I am currently proud to serve as president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Certainly with all of the events with COVID-19, everything going on around the world, it's been a challenging and engaging time for all of us. I want you to know that NCBA, both officers and staff, have been literally working round the clock to try to keep beef moving through the supply chain, to keep our to get beef into the grocery stores. The great thing is that we are certainly seeing great beef demand, and hope that we will be able to build on that as we work our way through this crisis. I'm sure you're all aware that there was a relief bill passed last week, providing over $9 billion to USDA to be distributed to and for the first time probably in any of these government programs includes the beef industry. Not all of that will be going to the beef industry, but a substantial part of it will. I want to make it clear, you know, in times like this, it seems to just sort of multiply the misinformation that gets out there. This is a program that's going to be established by USDA. We will all have input into it. But one of the things I want to make clear, this money will not be going to the packing industry. There's been some rumors that this was going to be a packer relief. Obviously, they don't really need relief right now. They're doing very profitable. This is for producers. We have said it's for producers all around the country. It's not going to, shouldn't favor one area or any size of producer. Don't take that to mean that it's just going to go to the large producers. This is for everybody, but the decision will be one made by USDA, not by NCBA, but we'll all have our input in that. So just want to point that out. Other things that we've really been working on, again, trying to keep beef on the shelves, keep the American public fed. We've been able to get, for instance, relaxed hours of service requirements for truckers so that we can keep them on the road, even going so far to make sure that the truck stops continue to sort of stay open and serve food so that we could keep our product moving, keep our cattle moving. Face some real challenges keeping packing plants open. We've had one shut down here right now because of illness amongst the management team as much as anything. But we're doing everything that we can to keep our product moving, to keep that supply chain going, and hopefully we will work through this together and end up a stronger association, a stronger industry. Tonight is our fifth and final installment in our webinar series focused on soils, forage, and grazing. We are proud to be partnering on this series with experts from across the country who serve at places like the Noble Research Institute, King Ranch Institute, NRCS, and many of our fine land-grant universities. Especially, I want to thank the many producers who have participated in this, who've been transparent and shared their own experiences, both good and bad, and shared how they've worked as stewards of land, forage, and cattle. During this presentation, as a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentation, we'll get as many of those questions answered as time will allow. If you have any trouble with your technology or you're joining us only for the audio, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org, and just look for the producer tab on the website. The webinar tonight, titled Optimizing Your Operation, Legumes, Crop Residues, and Cover Crops, features Dr. Mary Dranowski, who serves as Beef Systems Specialist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Dr. Keith Johnson, Professor of Agronomy and Forage Crop Specialist with the Purdue University Extension Service, and Lyle Perman, co-owner of Rock Hills Ranch in Lowry, South Dakota. His ranch was honored in the past as an Environmental Stewardship Award winner. And we'll start out. Lyle, the floor is yours, and thank you for participating and helping us with this.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be a part of the presentation tonight. And as Marty indicated, our ranch is Rock Hills Ranch, located near Lowry, South Dakota. Our mission is to reflect Christ and how we love people, manage the land, and care for its inhabitants, both domestic and wild. This picture that you're seeing on the screen was taken last summer. Like many areas in South Dakota, we had an abundance of moisture, and so I probably going to use this slide a lot to remind myself how green this country actually can look when we had a lot of moisture. This is a picture of our family, -1. The newest one is about 6 months old. It's my wife and I, and 7 of our 8 grandchildren in this picture. To my right, to your left, is my son Luke, and Luke runs the day-to-day operation on the ranch. His wife is below him, and then to the left, to my left, to your right, is my daughter and son-in-law, Chris and Kaiza White. They live near Franklin, Tennessee, and they frequent our ranch quite often to help out with various duties on the ranch. But Luke is the one that really runs the ranch on a day-to-day basis, and I'm the one that gets to talk about what all we're doing. So our ranch is located in north central South Dakota, about 90 miles north of our state capital up here. We have about 12,000 acres, of which 90% of it's grass, 10% crop, about 1,200 animal units, 18 inches of moisture. Those acres that are listed there, probably about 50% would be owned, and the balance would be leased. The 18 inches is normal. Last year we had about 22 inches of rain and 122 inches of snow. So the 36 inches of snow and about 15 inches of rain is normal. So we are still dealing with the aftermath of the excess moisture that we got last year. But it's been a good learning experience for both Luke and I on what we can do when we get, or need to do when we get too much moisture. Our operation is primarily a spring calving cow on the cow end of things. We do have a few fall calvers around that will market sometime probably in the next 60 to 90 days. We don't calve them out, but anything that doesn't conceive in the spring, for spring calving, we will expose for fall calving and try and add some value by marketing them as fall breds. We also custom graze sheep. You can see the paddock here. It's about 2 acres, and that's about 1,100 head that you see with our herder here in the bottom of your screen. The cattle that we do have, our plan, our goal is to never have to feed them. Our goal is to have them forage and graze year-round. This past winter, though, we didn't get a lot of snow, but we got enough snow, about 45 inches, most of that coming prior to the first of the year. Then it warmed up, and the snow melted some, and it got hard, and it was very difficult for the cattle to forage. So we ended up feeding them stored feed. And so you can see on the left, this is when we feed stored feed. This is one of the ways that we feed it. Our primary way is bale grazing. So in this area here, these are the bales that haven't been grazed that still have net wrap on them. This is purchased hay that we had. This is the hay that they're grazing on. And there's a hot wire that keeps them from the bales that have net wrap on. And this on the right-hand side shows you what it looks like when they've completed the grazing process. This is a hay field that we've got, and we try and feed our stored hay on our hay fields. And we we purchase quite a bit of hay, and so we try and import the nutrients and just leave them in areas that they do us good, so we don't have to spend money hauling the manure out of confinement lots. When we do have to feed in a more restricted area, this is another method that you can see doing it. This is a grass alfalfa mixture, and sometimes we just set the bales out and partially unroll them. So there is some protein supplement right in the legumes that are within these bales that the cattle have got. Speaking of legumes, we've got different types on our ranch. Sweet clover can be a problem. The picture I'm showing you here, it really isn't, but we do have certain soils on our ranch, tend to be heavy clays, that the sweet clover stands are very dense, and so we've always got a grazing plan, but I would say that the best way to describe our plan for grazing is adaptive. And so if it looks like we've got a problem in one part of our ranch with too much sweet clover, we'll move through and flash graze it to try and get some value out of the clover. Of course, it's a biennial, and so the first year in the fall, it makes wonderful late fall grazing. Then the following year, of course, it grows up and matures. And so we've got to be mindful of where those places are, where the stands are dense, try and open up the canopies so that we don't end up with the clover crowding out some of our native grasses and reducing our carrying capacity in future years because of the canopy. We do have other types of native, of course, sweet clover is an invader, but we do have a lot of native legumes on our ranch. To the left, you'll see a lot of lead plant. It's one of our favorites. The cattle do eat it, but not, I wouldn't say it's their favorite legume, but they do eat it. On the right, you'll see purple prairie clover. And we've got a lot of vetches that are native to our ranch. And we've had various people come on our ranch and take inventory of different plants we've got. And we have a lot of diversity in our ranch, and that's something we're proud of. But one of the problems we've got with the diversity is some of you might recognize the plant that is in the off to your left, and that's leafy spurge. And it's probably the big reason why we brought sheep in, because to control leafy spurge, we use Tordon. And the problem with it, it's very difficult to control, and you take out every broadleaf with it when you spray it. So we're concerned about those broadleaf forbs that we've got, in particular the legumes. And so that's why we've introduced sheep and use them primarily on mob grazing. This is some land that we recently purchased that we inherited the problem. And you can see in the foreground where we've had sheep the day before. The darker plants here would have been western snowberry, but you can see this is where they were the day before. Here's where they are now, and the next day they'll be in here. So sheep have been a good addition to our ranch in terms of providing a diversity and income stream, and also their diet compared to cattle. So one of the things that we use in the wintertime is our crop ground. You can see here it's corn stalks. Unfortunately, this year, because of the snow issue, we were unable to use corn stalks at all. Like I said, we got snow early and it froze, and it was just about zero corn stalk grazing this year. So we've been no-till farming on our ranch for the last almost 30 years, and the corn stalks are something that we depend on to get our cows through the winter. We calculate about 1 AUM per acre for every 100 bushel corn. So if it's 150 bushel corn crop, that means that we're probably at 0.75, or excuse me, 1.5 AUMs per acre. So it really is a valuable source of forage for us on our ranch. But when you feed just or graze just corn stalks, we do need to supplement them. We've got a bale bed on the back of a pickup, and this is one of the methods that we feed protein supplement. You can see this, of course, isn't on corn stalks, but we use this when we do graze corn stalks, corn residue. What you're seeing there on the ground is dried distillers. If we feel they need energy, we'll also put corn in there, and that's just a big tire off the front of a fertilizer spreader with a hole cut in it. And as the tire rotates, it puts piles on the ground. We try and buy dried distillers out of season, and so we get it usually for around $100 a ton for the dried distillers. And so when you consider that it's 28% protein, it really is a good supplement for us to use on corn stalk residue. We do also use a lot of cover crops. In this picture here, it's the stockers that we ran on oats, peas, brassicas. There probably was some vetch in there. Normally, when we put cover crop in, it's a minimum of 4 different plants that are seeded, and probably up to 8 different plants that we do use in our cover crop. This is what our cover crop looked like that we used this winter. You can see to the left, that's where the snow blew in, and we got 0 utilization out of it. To the right, you can see the utilization that did occur probably was, I'm going to say, 50%. We'd like to see a little better utilization than that, and 50% utilization might even be a stretch. It might have been quite a bit less than that. It still paid for us to graze it, even though there wasn't much of the cover crop sticking out. This particular seeding was a grain sorghum, and included brassicas in with that. And so anyway, like I said, it got buried in snow, and so it didn't provide us with quite what we were hoping for. So what have we learned from our cover crop plantings? This, of course, was some of the cover crop we planted this past year. And the issue we ran into, just like the last field that you saw, this is the same type of mixture, different supplier, but we ended up with the millet that was mixed in with the grain sorghum coming from one of the southern states, and they've got issues with weeds down there that we don't. Water hemp and Palmer amaranth in particular. And so the cover crop looked great, but we had to kill it because of the noxious weeds that were in there. And so it was one of the lessons that we've learned. We've been planting cover crops for probably, I'm going to say, 7 or 8 years. And just about when you think you've got it figured out, something new comes along. We've done everything from planting cereal rye to forage sorghum, grain sorghum, oats and peas, brassicas, vetches, and so we tried just a little bit of everything. And probably the first years that we started planting cover crops, we'd follow our wheat. That was the plan, follow our spring wheat harvest by putting a cover crop on it. And some years we didn't get enough moisture to get a good germination. Other years we got plenty of moisture, but it was too late. And so what we found is to really get the maximum benefit out of cover crops, it should be a full season. And so what you're looking at here and the prior slide was a full season cover crop. These are prevent plant acres that we had that were too wet to get a wheat, corn, or soybean seeding in, and so we resorted to planting a cover crop. I'm going to say that I'm happy to be in the livestock business, because what I've learned about being in the business is that we provide an ecosystem service that other people that are in agriculture have a hard time laying claim to. We can provide a home for birds, for mammals, insects, reptiles, because we've got a polyculture of different types of plants. And because we have livestock with in our operation, we can deliver cleaner air, cleaner water, and healthier soil. Our goal at Rock Hills Ranch is to convert solar energy into products for human consumption profitably while making a positive impact on our ecosystem. And if you want to communicate with me after this webinar, if you have questions or just want to check us out, our website address is listed on the bottom of the screen. So with that, I'll pass it off to our next presenter.
Okay, so Lyle gave us a good introduction talking about his use of cover crops, legumes, and residues, and I'm going to take a little further dive down into using cover crops and crop residue, in particular corn residue, as a forage resource. And I thought I would start with corn residue because I really think, as Lyle alluded to, it's a great resource for producers in the Midwest. And so first, let's look at really what are the protein and energy requirements of a spring calving cow during that winter. So mid-pregnancy and late pregnancy, you know, in mid-pregnancy, she's got fairly low energy and protein requirements, right? She's only at 44 for TDN. So her energy value is quite low. Protein's only about 6.2. And then in late gestation, so into that winter, we do start bumping up there, 54 TDN and 8.5 crude protein. So if we look at corn residue and we think about what is available out there, it's not just corn residue, right? It's actually a lot of different plant parts. And the best thing about grazing it is that cattle can select the best parts of the residue. And so if we look at the amount of residue, so if we look at kind of the bottom of the screen here, the amount of residue is mainly stem, which is also, if you look at this, lowly digestible, so it doesn't have a lot of energy in it. Doesn't have a whole lot of protein, and also is not palatable. So they're not going to select the stem. But one of the components that's actually in the least amount, husk, is the most digestible. So it has the most energy. So we look over here at the energy value. So look at those red bars. Coarse grain has the most energy of anything. So if we happen to have some down corn or some corn that gets missed, yeah, grain is a great supplement, both energy and protein out on residue. But then husk is pretty doggone good stuff. So if we look at husk here, husk is almost 60 TDN. That is better than most people's hay. 60 TDN will meet any late gestation cow's requirement. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of it out there, only 10% of the residue. So what we see is cattle select leaf and husk early on in the grazing. And leaf is in a little bit higher quantity out there. It's about 30% of the residue. So they can actually get enough intake during the day if they supplement their husk intake with a little bit of leaf. You can see it's a little bit less digestible. It's somewhere around 45. A little bit more protein than some of the other plant parts, though, somewhere around 6.5, while husk is fairly low. So the cows can put those two together and actually make a pretty good diet. It still seems like we should be low on protein, as Lyle suggested. So if we look at the quality that they're selecting over the grazing period, with this graph right here is basically the in vitro dry matter digestibility of what cattle selected while they were grazing. So this is basically in a field over time as they were grazing, what did they actually consume? This number here you can actually think of as TDN. So remember we talked about that mid-gestation cow requiring somewhere around 46 and a late gestation around 54. And what we see is early in the grazing period, they're selecting whatever grain they can happen to find. They're selecting more husk and they're selecting leaf. And then what we see is that as they go, they actually have to start supplementing that husk with a little bit more leaf. And as you continue to graze, they can actually get to where they actually have to start eating some cob to make up enough intake. And so what we want to do is we want to stop grazing before we actually get into that phase where they're selecting a lower quality diet. So that's actually on this particular graph, that would be about 50 days. Out here is where our recommended rate would be. And what that is, it's based off of exactly what Lyle told you. So Lyle told you that he goes for every 100 bushels, he shoots for 1 AUM. Essentially, that's the way I look at it too. I sometimes say 1 cow for 1 month for every 100 bushels. That's not quite right because, you know, most cows aren't 1,000 pounds anymore, but it's a good rule of thumb, 1 AUM per 100 bushels. So if I had, let's say, 180 acre field and let's say it's 200 bushel corn. I'm from Nebraska. We got some good corn, right, in the eastern part of the state. So I could get essentially 2 months if I stocked at 180 cows. You can do the math and say 2 times 180 and get 360 and then divide it by how many ever cows you have, and that tells you how many months you got. So what does it look like when we think about our targeted grazing rate? What it looks like is like somebody didn't graze very much. If the ground is frozen and we don't get a wet period and we graze to the recommended rate, you're only removing about 15% of the residue. And so what we see is this graph here, on one side we have ungrazed 200 bushel corn. On the other side, you can actually see there is a fence in the middle. This picture is a grazed side, and we really can't see huge differences, maybe a little bit more bare ground. But if you actually look, the big thing is the husk. You can't find husk on the grazed side. You can see there's some right there on the ungrazed side, and that's really the big difference. To me, grazing corn residue is all about the husk. If I start seeing limited amounts of husk out there, it's time to move. If we do that, then we actually can see that we don't need to supplement protein to mature cows. Now, let's say, you know, first calf heifers, that's a different story. They do need some supplemental protein. If I'm growing calves, of course, they need supplemental protein and energy. But our mature cows can actually get by quite well without it as long as the weather isn't too cold. And so this trial actually was 5 years where they were supplementing cows with 2 pounds of distillers out on corn residue, and they grazed at a recommended rate. So this is the supplement column, is 2 pounds of distillers during late gestation. The control was no supplement. Couple key things here is that the October time period, those cows were in good body condition. And when we grazed to our recommended rate, those who didn't get supplemented didn't lose body condition. Those who did get supplemented gained a little bit of body condition, but as we see, pregnancy rates really didn't differ due to supplementation. Calf birth weight, calf weaning weight, we really didn't see any benefits. And in fact, we even looked at what might happen in utero. So, you know, we talk about what happens to that cow nutritionally when she's pregnant can affect that calf. And if we kept those heifers out of those cows and we looked at their post-weaning performance, and what we saw no difference in their growth rate, we saw no difference in their age at puberty, and no difference in their breed up. And so the bottom line is, if we graze at a recommended rate and the weather cooperates, as Lyle mentioned, sometimes the weather does not cooperate, we can get by without supplementing on stocks, which basically suggests those cows are pretty doggone good at recycling nitrogen in their system. And I think sometimes we overestimate their supplementation needs because what they're selecting is so high in energy that they can actually digest enough to get by. If you want more information, I would suggest you look up our NEB guide on grazing crop residues. It has a lot of the information I talked about today in there. You can go to go.unl.edu/residue. It's a great resource. And then, of course, feel free to contact me. Now we're going to talk about the sexier topic, talk a little bit about using cover crops and selecting cover crops. So the first thing I want to mention is that with every consideration, goals are important. So cover crop selection is no different. It's all about goals. And I'm going to tell you a little bit today about using cover crops for forage. And so I'm going to assume that forage is a high priority. And so with that, I'm going to focus on grasses, because grasses are the biomass producers. They're really king when it comes to producing forage or biomass. And so don't skimp on the grass if forage is a goal. I'm not suggesting that you can't plant other species, but remember your goals, and if that other species brings in something for another goal, great. But you got to prioritize and think through what your goals are. So if I'm thinking about cover crop selection, the next thing I'm really going to consider is planting date. I think that is probably one of the #1 things you need to consider as you start thinking about species selection. And I'm going to dive into that and talk about some of those thought processes. And then, of course, crop rotation, that affects when you can plant, so planting date. But it also affects that timing of when you might be able to graze or harvest or use that forage before you put in your next crop. And those can be huge and have huge repercussions on those selections. Okay, so it's all about planting date. And as Lyle kind of referred to, soil moisture can have a huge impact in Nebraska, in the western part of the state. What we might do in terms of being able to double crop and what we might be able to do in the eastern part of the state are very different. And Lyle mentioned that sometimes after wheat, we have a challenge double cropping. And that's true in the western part of our state as well. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of our producers do. But if I think about planting date, really that after wheat, we could plant in July. We could plant warm season summer annuals, or we might delay a bit planting and plant winter season, winter sensitive cool season species. And the choice may come down to forage quality and what you're trying to get to. So warm season summer annuals can produce a lot of biomass. The winter sensitive species like oats are not going to produce not nearly as much biomass, but they can be very high quality. And so if I'm shooting for something to, say, winter graze my cows because I don't have stocks, then I might go with a warm season annual. If I'm looking for something to graze, let's say replacement heifers or to background some calves, I might delay planting a bit and choose a winter sensitive cool season species. Now, the next thing is about that gap, really September 1 onward, you're not going to get enough forage production really to get much fall or winter grazing. And so we actually suggest in Nebraska switching to winter hardy species like rye or triticale. And the reason why is because what little bit of growth you do get isn't going to amount to enough, and there's a lot of risk of not getting very much growth. And so switching to something that you could use in the spring may make a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit about the warm season annuals real quick. And in particular, the king, the one most people are familiar with, in my mind, is sorghum Sudan hybrids. A lot of people plant sorghum Sudans for hay production, prevent plant. A couple years ago, I mean, we had a lot of sorghum Sudan being planted. It can produce 4 to 5 tons in good conditions. It can produce a lot of biomass. A couple challenges with sorghum Sudan is it can be fairly big stemmed. So if you are trying to hay it, I do suggest you actually don't skimp on the seeding rate because that'll give you bigger stems. So having a higher plant population can help to make those stems a little bit smaller. You do need a hay conditioner. In my mind, that's probably the only way to go with sorghum Sudan. But I have a couple of other highlighted here, and then one would be Sudan grass. And I like Sudan grass because it does a better job of regrowth than sorghum Sudan. So if I was wanting to graze it during that growing season, during that summer period, Sudan grass actually can produce just as much biomass when you allow it to have regrowth periods, whereas sorghum Sudan sometimes doesn't recover very well. Pearl millet's one to mention. That's actually in this picture on the top here. And I like pearl millet because it doesn't produce prussic acid. So that means that you don't have to worry about grazing it when it's really short, and you also don't have to worry about grazing it during the frost period. So especially with a double crop, if you're not going to start getting onto it until late summer, early fall, instead of having to pull those cows off during the frost period, if you go with pearl millet, you don't have to worry about that. You can get yields that are just as good with pearl millet as you can sorghum Sudan. I've seen some varieties that do very well. The last one's sorghum here. I really like forage sorghum for silage. I don't like it for grazing, and I'm not fond of it for hay because it produces too big of a stem. Do have foxtail millet. Millets are different. There's a lot of different ones out there, but I wanted to bring up foxtail millet for the instance that Lyle talked about, that after wheat situation where I have low precipitation. Foxtail millet's very cheap. It's very fast maturing. It's like a 60-day maturity. And so it's fairly low risk if you want to try double cropping it after wheat in low rainfall situations, because you didn't put a lot of money into it. If you get something out of it, great. And if you don't, you didn't lose a lot. It's usually going to cost you $10 to $15 in seed cost, whereas these others may be $25 to $30. Okay, late summer planted, cool season, winter sensitive species can be extremely high quality, especially if you delay planting a little bit into, for our area, that would be planting the 1st to 15th of August. We can get some great forage quality because they're growing into cooling conditions, and so we don't see the small grains like oats, triticale, and barley actually maturing, so they don't put on as much lignin, so their quality is very high. My two favorite ones to plant is actually oats and rapeseed together. The reason I like these two is cost and quality. So I have a picture here of rapeseed, and it's basically like most of the other brassicas, like turnips and radishes, in that it's very high quality, but it doesn't produce a bulb. It only produces the leaf, and it actually produces a taproot, and that's what that picture is. So I like that because that allows me to graze as much as or as little as I want and maintain ground cover while actually making use of the brassica. Sometimes with the turnips and radishes, they can produce quite a bit of bulb, and to get them to cattle to actually graze that, you actually they eat off all of the grass, they eat off all of the leaf of the turnip, and then they will start getting into the bulbs. And so a lot of times you end up with a bit more bare ground. Okay, timing's everything with late summer planting, and I just wanted to show you the difference between 2 weeks in the late summer. So we have some oats that we planted after corn silage on September 3rd, or we drilled after high moisture corn 2 weeks later, September 17th. And you can see we went from almost 1.5 tons of forage production to 500 pounds an acre, basically nothing more than about 3 inches of growth. So when I hear people say I tried that and didn't work, it's usually timing driven, or we happen to have a situation like a rainfall that didn't really work out. But I would say for us, September 1st is drop dead date. If you're further north, it's probably a little bit earlier. If you're further south, it's probably a little bit later. What I mean by drop dead date is switch to a winter hardy. If you're going to plant after that, don't go with the winter sensitive. Did want to show you the nutritive value. I know I've got a lot of stuff on this table, but really what I wanted to show you is brassicas are very, very high quality. I think about them as like alfalfa hay and corn grain put together. So I have radish, and I just wanted to focus on the leaves, and turnips, focus on the leaves, and look at the crude protein content. 18 to 13% crude protein. I've seen ones that are much higher than this even. So think about it like alfalfa hay. And then if we think about the energy content, we're 81 to 82 TDN. Corn grain and a forage-based diet is 82 TDN. So they are a great supplement to a grass. So I like actually a mix of a brassica with a grass like an oat for that late summer planting. You can see the oats that we planted. This was after wheat in eastern Nebraska. We did plant fairly early August. A little bit lower protein, 9.6, but still good stuff. TDN's very high. I mean, 58. Hard to find good hay that's that good. But the thing about brassicas, while they can be very cheap, like that rapeseed I talked about, right now is usually running about $1 a pound, and I can put 3 pounds in and get a lot of forage. The problem is that they're also very high sulfur, and so I need some more fiber and some lower sulfur in their diet, and so I accomplish that by putting some oats in there. So I like a mix of an oat with a brassica for that late summer planting. The stuff's very high quality, and it maintains its quality even when it dies. So the brassicas look horrible in the winter when they die, and they look all brown, but they maintain their quality really well. So don't let that deceive you. It'll melt down, it'll look horrible, but you can get really great gains on calves. So I have on here just various mixes that we have grazed, either oats and brassicas or oats alone, and we can get somewhere between 2 to 1.3 pound a day gain on weaned calves in November and December. The big factor really wasn't so much the species we selected, as long as we had these cool season winter sensitive species, but a big driver was really the weather. In 2015, we got our lowest gains, and that was really not driven by forage quality so much as we had a really wet winter where they got a lot of precipitation on them, and it was a lot of freezing rain, and so they had to use a lot of energy to stay warm, so we didn't get as good gains. I did want to show you though that brassicas can improve the gain on calves, and so we've been doing some side-by-side comparisons of a monoculture of oats planted after actually early harvested corn silage, or adding rapeseed into the mix. So 50 pounds per acre of oats plus 3 pounds of rapeseed versus 100 pounds of oats. We get the same forage yields, but we get a little bit better gains out of calves. And I know these don't look huge different, 2.11 versus 1.95, but we're actually picking it up statistically. It's that consistent. The other thing, and the big driver for me, is this mix costs about $5 an acre less than the oats alone, and so same forage production, a little bit greater cattle performance, and less seed cost. Why not, right? Good mix. Okay, fall planting. So if you can't get it in before September 1st, switch to fall. Switch to these winter hardy species. Everybody knows cereal rye. Cereal rye comes on very quick in that spring, and so you can get some growth early, but it also matures very quickly. So if your window is relatively short in the spring, then yeah, cereal rye is the way to go. And in fact, choosing a southern rye like Elbon rye, it comes on even quicker. It comes out of dormancy earlier, and so you can get even more yield, but you can see it also matures more quickly. Winter wheat's very cheap, but it's very slow. And so what we see is that we typically have delayed forage productivity out of it, but you also have a larger window to get in if you were going to harvest, because it doesn't mature as quickly. And triticale, in my mind, is kind of the best of both worlds. It does grow more rapidly in the spring, get some higher yields earlier. The challenge with it is that it's a little bit more expensive, and so a lot of people balk at the cost of the seed. But I really think if I can go later into the spring, then I like to think about triticale. So winter triticale. I do want to show you that even with cereal rye, you can get good gains on calves. The quality can be great. The key is to start grazing early, probably earlier than you think you should. Like we used to tell you something like, wait till it gets 8 inches. With cereal rye, we start grazing at 4 to 5 inches. I do suggest you dividing that down at least into halves so you can start grazing on one and move. and be able to kind of get some rotation going. The annuals are very rapidly growing, and you can kind of keep up with them a little bit better and have some higher stocking densities on it. If you want to learn a little bit more, I do suggest we have a document called Considerations for Using Annual Forages Cost Effectively. Just go to go.unl.edu/cover forage, and you'll find that document. It has a lot of the stuff I outlined in a little bit more detail for you. And with that, I will hand it over to our next speaker.
Well, thank you very much. It's very much a pleasure to be here this evening with you, and I really appreciated the message that Lyle and Mary gave. My name is Keith Johnson. I am the Purdue Extension Forage Specialist, and the topic that I was challenged to give tonight was dealing with legumes. I decided that I would add an adjective to that, and I think there's something magical about legumes. What we're going to do tonight is learn about the value, but also, as with everything, there can be some constraints, and we'll spend some time also looking at the issues that legumes may give to us that we may need to deal with. Tonight, I thought to help keep you engaged and just to challenge your knowledge a bit, would encourage you to get a piece of paper, a pen or a pencil, and as we go through this, I've got different pictures of legumes, and you'll see the numbers there in the box, and have an opportunity to win a Purdue University Forage Field Guide. And you know, if everybody here has a tie score, I'm willing to give everyone one of these, but let's see how we do as we go through this. My emphasis today is to look at legumes as part of a perennial grass legume pasture. For the time that we have this evening, this is going to be the point of emphasis, and I think this is a thing of great contribution that legumes can make to cool season grasses in particular. I want to say that my experiences have been in the Midwest USA. I'm based out of Indiana. I grew up in the great state of Nebraska. So the Central Great Plains is something that I have some knowledge base previously in my life. Let me say, though, that forages are very regional. And somebody that might have an interest in a legume, let's say in Florida, I'm probably not the person for you. You need to be looking with people that are trained in regionality, specifically as they work with the forages that are widely adapted. Some are, but some are very much to a specific region of the country. So I encourage you, if you have not, to find professionals that their passion is forage crops, really understand them, and can help you there at that regional and local level. So what are legumes? Well, they're a member of the plant family Fabaceae, and of course you go, what the heck's a Fabaceae? If we look at a definition out of a forage's textbook, it states it's a plant family, commonly referred to as legumes. They include peas, beans, many important forage species that form symbiotic associations with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And I really think this is one of the magical things about legumes as compared to any other species, that, gosh, they can take nitrogen from the soil air through those nodules on those roots and convert it to a protein source that's very, very important to the consuming animal. Opportunity then, as we think about rotation, a great nitrogen credit because of the fact that we have a plant that is high in nitrogen, but the fact that we don't have to add any nitrogen fertilizer of a commercial sort is just an outstanding, magical sort of thing. Longevity varies, and so we have annuals. We have winter annuals. We have summer annuals. If you were listening well to Lyle, you learned about a biennial. And we also have perennials. My emphasis tonight, as we think about these pastures, will be permanent pastures, and my point of emphasis tonight will be on the perennials. So why legumes? As I brainstormed the topic, I thought, okay, these are things that, at least in my area of the country, that I think are most important. I think about forage quality. I think about summer productivity. I do think about the ability to produce nitrogen. I think about the concern that many of us in this region of the country have with tall fescue and the toxicity factor. And I also think about something that isn't mentioned very often, but we'll see a little bit of data here in the near future that suggests that legumes can help mitigate issues of grass tetany. So if we look at forage quality, and we've got the alfalfa, and we have the timothy. Okay, so we've got a representative of legumes, the alfalfa, cool season grasses, timothy. We've got a greater protein content. We have less fiber in legumes, which means that we get a greater dry matter intake, which is critically important when we think about quality forage. The other thing about legumes, as you can see, is represented by the alfalfa, that for a better quality, we want to have a faster cell wall digestion rate. And certainly that's the case when we look at alfalfa versus the timothy in this particular slide. If we look at a compilation of research that was evaluated, it's been shown that legumes in cool season grass pastures that were fertilized with nitrogen, as compared to grass pastures that were fertilized with nitrogen, that a grass legume pasture increased calf gains a very significant 0.35 pound per day. So certainly the quality characteristics that we look here translate into better productivity of the grazing animal. I look at summer productivity, and there are three different types of forages types that I have here. I have cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and forage legumes. So when I think about a cool season grass, we can think about orchard grass. It might be tall fescue, might be further west there, the wheat grasses, ryegrass, brome grass, and so forth. We're breaking dormancy now, as I think probably in a lot of the country that's happening. And then we have the situation in terms of cool season grasses. They grow when it's cool. So if we follow this, if I can find my cursor, here we go. Cool season grasses grow when it's cool. Here we are in the springtime. As we move into summer, we find that we have a, if you will, a bit of a dormancy happening. And then as we get into the cool of fall, we find that we have another source of forage growth occurring in the late summer and into the early fall. My warm season grasses I have depicted there by the native big blue stem. We find that warm season grasses that are perennial are going to break dormancy about a month later as compared to cool season grasses. And as the name would suggest, they grow when it's warm. So breaking dormancy sometime in late April, early May, depending on where we're at in the USA. And we get into the summer months, that's where the greater amount of productivity is going to occur. And then we taper off as we get into the fall. If you follow the forage legumes, what we see is they start out in a similar sort of growth rate as compared to cool season grasses. But then when we get to this time frame of the summer, what we see is that we've got more productivity of the legumes as compared to the accompanying cool season grasses. So as a result, we can bolster the yield and capacity of the pasture then to graze more animals in the summer when we have cool season grasses and legumes together as compared to cool season grasses fertilized with nitrogen fertilizer and no legumes. The nitrogen value. This is going to depend on how much legume is in that grass pasture. But I'm going to suggest, after looking at a lot of research, that greater than 100 pounds per acre of commercial nitrogen fertilizer on a grass can produce, similarly, a yield of 50-50 grass legume stand will be equivalent to that grass that receives 100-150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Also, some research that we did do in Indiana, we had a couple of years that we were looking at the corn grain yield following a red clover seeding the previous year. And we found that the red clover was giving a credit for nitrogen to the following corn crop of at least 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's extremely significant in my mind, and one of the advantages that we have as forage livestock producers as compared to cash grain individuals alone. Fescue toxicosis, a real issue yet throughout certain location of the country. This fescue toxicosis, and I have a picture of tall fescue there, the inflorescence in the upper right and leaf blade down below. But there's an endophyte. This is a fungal growth. It's within the plant. If we take a look here, we can see the ovals that you see there and those little squiggles within the oval. Those are the hyphae of the endophytic fungus, and those produce nasty compounds called ergoalkaloids. And these ergoalkaloids cause a lot of problem with the consuming animal. It constricts blood vessels. It can cause lameness. We think about fescue foot and hoof sloughing and so forth. So that's a type of toxicosis all to its own. And then we think about the summer toxicity, the summer fescue summer toxicity, where we have temperatures that are elevated. This causes reduced conception. We have less milk production. We result in lower average daily gains. So still a major concern in a fairly large region of the country. This area that I have here in the oval has been historically called the fescue belt, and a lot of acreage is still in this type of tall fescue that has the endophytic fungus within it. Thank goodness for investment in plant breeding. One of the great things we have learned is about low endophyte tall fescues, as well as the novel endophyte that do not have these ergoalkaloids, and so it just made a total difference. But topography constraints are such that a lot of this acreage, I think rightfully so, has remained in the original tall fescue, so then it's a matter of having to reduce the associated problems with it. So there was a lot of work that was done, particularly in the 1970s and the 1980s, as how to get these high quality legumes into these endophyte infected tall fescue pastures. What we heard about was dilution might be a solution, and it seemed to be, because when we would put adapted legumes with the tall fescue, we found that we were able to increase average daily gain. We were able to increase conception rate. And so this did reduce fescue toxicosis problems. Now, more recently, very, very interesting work is that particularly looking at red clover, which in our region, red clover is the forage that seems to be interseeded or overseeded the most into these cool season pastures, that red clover has a compound called isoflavones. And remember that I said that one of the problems of the ergoalkaloids, they constrict the blood vessels, whereas these isoflavones in red clover actually relaxes them and reduces the effects of the fescue toxicosis. So it's more than dilution is a solution. It actually looks like that there's something called isoflavones within red clover that essentially can help reduce the effects of toxicosis in a little different way than just by dilution. I mentioned the grass tetany. That is caused by low magnesium in cool season grasses that are growing quickly in the spring, and it can happen in the wet fall time frame. Interestingly, we find that magnesium is greater in legumes. And what grass tetany does, it causes the animals to appear dull. They can have a staggered gait. They're nervous. They can have tremors. They can fall down. And if we don't get to them quickly, death is going to occur. So what I'm showing here is the sufficiency range. So if you look at the red with the grasses, the sufficiency range for grasses for magnesium is only 0.1 to 0.3%. And the part of the plant that you sample for grasses are the 4 uppermost leaves for sufficiency. And alfalfa, you look at the top 6 inches, but the sufficiency range there is 0.31 to 1%. And with red clover, what you would send to the laboratory to determine sufficiency is the top third of the leaves. We find that that's 0.21 to 0.6. You know, that's a lot greater than 0.1 and 0.30. So you get a mixture of legumes with grasses, and each bite that animal takes is going to have more magnesium within it. So certainly continue to feed magnesium supplements. I'm not suggesting one does not do that, but I do find that this is something that is another advantage of having legumes in those perennial grass pastures. Well, let's move on to the constraints then. There's always some things we need to, be transparent about in terms of some great things about legumes, but what are some of the constraints? Well, I think we have to look at the soil. And the picture there has the bronze-looking plant. It's still bronze here in Indiana. That's broom sedge. I was told by good folk in southern Indiana the first year on staff that they called broom sedge poverty weed. And the reason is that no animal is going to consume that. And it's a bio indicator of low pH. And what we find with legumes is they're going to require a bit of a higher soil pH than our grasses grown alone. And so one has to keep that in mind, that grasses do okay, at a pH of 6 and 6.2, but when we put legumes into it, we better think about a pH that's probably more than 6.5, closer to neutrality. And the example of the low pH of broom sedge, not even good quality grasses are going to grow there. My hunch would be that pH is probably around a pH of 5 or so. The other thing about legumes regarding fertility is we need to keep in mind that legumes do require more potassium per ton of production than do grasses. And what I'm showing in this particular slide, if you look at the leaf margins of the alfalfa, you can see that we've got some freckles around there on the outer leaflets. That is the key classical picture of what potassium deficiency looks like in an alfalfa plant, and be similar in white clover and red clover as well. So we do need more potassium with legumes as compared to growing straight grass. The other thing is drainage. The good news is there's differences in adaptation to drainage. Certainly alfalfa requires a better drained soil, which red clover can get along quite well with moderate type of drainage. And then white clover, even in that moderate, a little less moderate drainage, they will survive. So there are differences with legumes in that regard. Broadleaf weed control can be very, very limited. When we have weeds, like I'm showing there, the picture in the upper there is ironweed. It has rhizomes. Those are those underground stems that new plants can vegetatively propagate from another, and the problem can grow if you don't take care of it. The other one down in the lower portion is one that's really coming to the Midwest in a big way in the last 10 years. That's poison hemlock. This thing can really come on starting about now and be a plant that's 6 feet tall when you move into June and has poisonous properties. But we need to get broadleaf weeds under control before we think about the introduction of legumes into the grasses, because if we don't, and we have a very weedy mess that are broadleaves, when we think about utilizing a chemical, the likelihood of causing severe damage to the legumes that we have painstakingly and put a lot of money into are going to have survivability problems as well as the weeds. Well, let's think about bloat. The good news is not all legumes are potentially bloating. And I know cattlemen here tonight know what that's all about. It can be real severe, but we do have some non-bloating legumes. Some of these I've worked with here in Indiana. Others are, I would say, more Western, such as Sanfoin and Sicer milk vetch. Annual Lesbedeza, Serratia lesbedeza. Unfortunately, as Lyle mentioned about sweet clover having an invasive nature, Serratia lesbedeza is considered by many regions and states in the country to be invasive. You know, a favorite of mine here in the Midwest that is underutilized, I strongly believe, is bird's foot trefoil. I think the reason that people try it and maybe get disenfranchised with it is this is a plant that cannot be overgrazed. And if you graze that down to a 2 or 3 inch height and no leaf matter is showing, that plant is not going to survive. So this is a plant that cannot take overgrazing well to survive. But if we take care of it in that regard and think about this as a plant, particularly in the upper Midwest, I think it's an underutilized pasture legume. The other thing that I became aware of as I interact with my colleague here, Dr. Ron Lemonager at Purdue, he's mentioned this several times, and as I brainstorm again this presentation, I thought we needed to talk about the excess nitrogen intake potential of legumes. So when grazing is occurring in the springtime in particular, or as far as that goes, even mid-season, depending on maturity of the plant, they're lush, they're vegetative, high protein content, therefore we can have excess protein nitrogen intake occur. And that has an effect on the uterine environment of the cow. It increases blood urea nitrogen, and the fact is that there's an inverse relationship between blood urea nitrogen and uterine pH. And as a result, that can be a situation that is not favorable for implantation. It's been documented that we have increased hormone prostaglandin, and this occurs when there is no embryo implantation. So the other thing that is noted is that early embryo mortality has occurred when a producer is fed 4 pounds of hay and lots of distiller grains. A third of the herd was open. Cows that were on alfalfa as compared to mixed pastures had a less 20% reduction in pregnancy rate. So again, composition of the forage quite different in that regards. The other thing is there's dairy literature that strongly suggests that too much blood urea nitrogen or milk urea nitrogen can reduce pregnancy rates. So for those of you that need interpretation there, the milligrams, or the mg is milligrams, the dl is deciliters, is the values there, but you can look up those particular information that are in those journals if interested. The other thing is, if you take care of grasses, they tend to last a long, long time. Unfortunately, we do our best to take care of the legumes, and even if we plant highly resistant varieties, when we talk about highly resistant legumes, we're looking at plants that are probably 50% or greater in terms of resistance to particular diseases. It's not a 100% sort of thing. And so we do find that stand decline is going to occur. And I show a picture here of an older alfalfa plant that has crown and root rot, and you know, that reduces productivity. So in time, we're going to have to think about reintroduction of legumes into this grass dominant pasture, and that's, you know, loosely a term that we talk about renovation process. The other thing is, if alfalfa was the component of that, we understand that there's an autotoxicity of alfalfa. An old alfalfa plant releases a compound that can have effect on the germination and emergence of new seedlings. And research has indicated that the zone of influence of a plant, and that's what I'm showing here in the middle of this picture. Here's let's say an alfalfa plant that is still living, that it's going to have, and we've got a diameter here of 16 inches, that's what this black line is, that plant is going to have an influence 8 inches on either side of it in terms of an effect potentially on the seedling development of another alfalfa seedling and plant. So we may have to think about overseeding red clover to get around the autotoxicity factor, or, you know, again, if it's a very, very thin stand where there's only one plant per square yard or something like that, one shouldn't be too concerned about alfalfa autotoxicity in a very, very weak stand in a grass pasture. So do the benefits of legumes outweigh the constraints? Well, I've got my answer, but I'll let you answer that question. The things that I think it provides is quality, summer productivity, we get some nitrogen value, opportunity to reduce fescue toxicity, and also the fact that grass tetany can be reduced as well by inclusion of legumes in these grass pastures. So I really want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. I encourage you to be part of your cattle, forage, and range organizations. They really do care about you and your livelihood. Great organizations. You know, our host tonight, the American Forage and Grassland Council, Society for Range Management, state organizations, local organizations as well. So I encourage you to get involved and consider the education process and all that they provide for you in representing you in doing important things for us. So what do we have? Well, these are the answers, and I would suggest as you look at them, and if you're interested, feel free to email me your answers, and I will do the grading, and I'd be happy to send to the winners a Purdue Forage Field Guide. Let me say that this particular quiz tonight is for those that are on live only, not for those that are recording. So please, I hope you played along with the game and kept you engaged a little bit and tested your knowledge as to what legumes we did have in the picture. But I'm here, as the rest of us are tonight, to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters tonight. NCBA Cattlemen Webinar Series works to bring you the latest and relevant information, and our presenters tonight have certainly helped us achieve that goal and brought a lot of timely and valuable information to us and given us a lot to think about. As you'll see from this slide, as we move into our question and answer session, I want to remind everybody that our Washington, D.C. legislative meeting should be happening right now. Obviously, we've had to cancel that or postpone it. Congress is more or less out of session, and all of the Washington, D.C. Facilities are closed, so we were not going to be able to do anything there. We are looking forward to hopefully everything with the COVID-19 working its way through so that we can reconvene in Washington. However, just want everybody to know that our Washington staff and our Denver staff is staying very hard at work and continuing to really achieve a lot for cattle producers from all over the country. I mentioned a couple of those before, efforts to keep our supply chain open. One of the things that you may not see anything about, I wanted to mention, was that we were able to get EPA to agree not to do any inspection or enforcement action during the pendency of this, so that our producers don't have to worry about EPA showing up with trying to catch somebody off guard during these troubled times with a spot inspection or something. So we'll keep working on a lot of different elements. Appreciate everybody being here. We're taking part in this tonight. Would ask everybody to, if you're not an NCBA member, certainly take a look at it. This is the kind of thing we do in addition to all of the other work that goes on with our organization. We also have a webinar set for May the 5th on health considerations for cattle heading into and spending time at the feed yard. So at this point, let's turn it over for questions, and I'll hand it over to Josh White with NCBA to address and to moderate the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Marty, for hosting tonight and making time for it. I know you're super busy with all that's going on, so thank you for that. We do have a few questions that have come through. One interesting one here about a grass that I've not heard of. So Garrison creeping meadow foxtail. Is this a good grazing grass for cattle? Seems to thrive in wet areas. Any of our panelists know anything about that?
I can address it. This is Lyle Perman. We have Garrison creeping foxtail. For us, it's been a cash crop for seed, and we do put it up for hay. It's in a location that is not very suitable for grazing because it does well where it's really wet. And but I would say if you've got a wet area that you have a difficult time getting grasses to grow because it's wet, it most certainly is a good plant there. I would say the key is to try and get it grazed early because it matures early. When we harvest seed on it, now you have to remember northern South Dakota, our grasses are just beginning to emerge now. Our snow is just melting, and Garrison creeping foxtail, I would say by the 1st of July has dropped its seed or will be very shortly. So it's something that you want to be able to graze in June, and if it's too wet for you to do that in June, and you start looking at July or August in our part of the world, then the quality of the forage definitely would become an issue.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on that one, or?
Yes, I'll make a comment. This is Keith Johnson. So we have had concerns about reed canary grass being invasive in the state of Indiana. The legislature, as of tomorrow, has made reed canary grass an unpurchasable through seedsmen in the state. And knowing this was potentially going to happen, right now there's consideration of whether that will go forward or not. But I was looking at, okay, we've got these wet spots, and realize when I hear about 18 inches, and I know east central Nebraska might be getting 27, it's not unusual here in Indiana to be getting, over 40 inches of rain, and there were areas last year that got 60. So we do have a lot of wet issues. And so I put in 3 locations in extremely wet conditions, reed canary grass. I did put Garrison creeping foxtail, tall fescue, and I'm going to try, and I don't know if it'll be successful, but we'll be looking at switchgrass and eastern gamma grass in these areas too. They're warm seasons, so we'll be getting them planted in the next, in a month or 6 weeks or so. But I guess my question to Lyle is regarding the Garrison then. Do you find that it potentially could be considered to be an invasive species, much like individuals are suggesting reed canary grass can be?
I would say yes. The problem is where we have it growing, right now there's probably a foot of water, and it destroys it. And then we get some dry years and it comes back. But it most certainly, you talk about Reed's canary being invasive, Garrison creeping foxtail will definitely spread also, and your problem won't be solved. If you don't like Reed's canary, you might not like Garrison creeping foxtail because it'll do the same thing.
Yeah.
But I would say it's probably a better quality plant though.
Okay, very good.
All right, one for Mary. Mary, on grazing management for corn stalks, do you you mentioned breaking up an area with either creep grazing or multiple paddocks when you're grazing that young cereal rye. Do you recommend a similar strategy on corn stalks? More of a management system like that versus continuous grazing, or what have you seen in, in how utilization works out with various grazing management systems on corn stalks?
Give me a tough question, Josh. No, I'm joking because it is a bit of a tough question. Theoretically, the idea of breaking it up and giving access to newer sections, even infrequently, can improve the plane of nutrition. Because if you think about that that cycle, right, they're on a declining plane of nutrition the longer they're on a field, because they're selecting the best parts first and then going towards the lower quality stuff. So doing something where you say you split it up and then give them a new section, you're boosting their nutrition again. The challenge with that model is that there's a risk in the winter that you get a big snowfall or an ice event and can't utilize the residue that you haven't got onto. And so what happens is that in some cases, while that may seem like a good idea, if you get that problem, then you didn't make use of the best components of all of the field or all of your field. So it's a balancing act, and there's a risk to the management and risk versus reward. I know some people use that module. There are some guys who actually have high enough numbers of cattle to where they do a high density stocking on a field, so they still use a whole field, but then they do move quite frequently, maybe once a week, onto new fields, and they get along very well until they have to pull off because of an ice event, and maybe they don't get to make use of a field. So from the plane of nutrition standpoint, it does make some sense, and it can reduce loss due to trampling if you do get a wet event when the ground's not particularly frozen. We've actually been doing some work looking at stocking density, but it's a little bit challenging because it just seems like it all depends on what the weather does.
Yeah,
I might say,
yeah, go ahead.
I might say in our ranch as a Lyle, we usually limit them to about 7, I would say 7, maybe 10 days worth of grazing at a time. We never put them on a whole field at once.
Great. Yeah, it does sound like it's weather dependent and season dependent. Lyle, while we've got you here, so you were talking about challenges that you've had grazing stalks. What would you say if you look kind of at a 10-year window? How many years out of 10 do you feel like you're able to successfully graze those corn stalks and get the value that you want out of them?
Well, ideally, we're going to start grazing probably in December and continue grazing until the 1st of March when the frost comes out. That model, I would say, happens for us probably a third of the time. We'd like to be able to at least get till the 1st of the year, so get 30 to 45 days for the grazing, or 60 days for the grazing. But this year we got 0. So I would say to the 1st of March, 1 out of 3. Probably to the 1st of to into January, probably another third. And I would say what happened to us this year, in the last 10 years, it's the only time that occurred.
Well, that's good to hear. At least that was only the one time. Dr. Johnson, question back to you. You talked a bit about alfalfa there, sort of mixed into other legume discussions. I know that the breeding, there's been a lot of evolution and adaptability of alfalfa over the last 20 to 30 years, different varieties suited better for different soil types, different, more heat tolerant, more, tolerant of different soils. Where do you think, the breeding's taken us a certain distance, but where do you think the producers have not kept up? Where are there opportunities to use alfalfa that it's not being used because of the the producers don't know about it or are unwilling to try it, or where are we not using it? We could be.
Well, this is an opinion of mine. I really think that we've made improvements in alfalfa. It has not been like any of the forages. We have not made improvements as compared to corn or soybean. The investment in corn and soybean is, I don't know how many times greater than investing in any of these grasses that we have that we call forages. But I think we've under invested to look at opportunities of improvement in all forage species. If I look at alfalfa, right or wrong, if you look at what's happened in the last, 15 years, the Roundup Ready trait, mixed reviews on what one thinks about that. The other thing that's come along more recently is lesser lignin alfalfa. That has been indicated to be an opportunity to harvest maybe one time lesser in the season, but still have similar yields. It's a bit of a weather beater, if you will, from the standpoint that we can let it get a little bit more mature. There's less lignin, which means it will keep digestibility better as compared to the other conventional type of varieties. Where opportunities, I think in well-drained soils that there's an opportunity for alfalfa that's adapted, along with adapted cool season grass, more so than what we do have. Frankly, in this part of the country, though, soil drainage is a major constraint to alfalfa. We have a lot of soils that have fragipans in them, so we have perched water tables in the spring that aren't very conducive to alfalfa production because of alfalfa heaving and wet soils. But I think there is an opportunity of including it again in more grazing situations along with adapted cool season grasses. The thing that's great about alfalfa production is the differences in fall dormancy are huge. As we think about across the country, we have varieties that are adapted to, the Southwest. We have varieties that are adapted to the cold regions in North Central. And, we have, again, great diversity in the genetics that allow us then to exploit that aren't found in other legumes that I'm aware of.
All right. Here's a short one. How does big blue stem reproduce?
Well, I'll give my take on it. It's seed, but it does have what I would call short rhizomes. It definitely is not super aggressive in that regard. But it's a seed producer with very short rhizomes. Mary, what do you think?
I think you're the forage man. You got it.
Okay.
I would concur.
Go ahead. All right, we have consensus. Here's one more, and unless someone else types another one in, this may be our last one for Dr. Johnson. How does the longevity of bird's foot trefoil in a stand compare to what you would typically expect for alfalfa?
Did you say in a stand?
Correct.
Yeah. Again, it all comes down to not overgrazing that plant. And, we get pressed, and I think from the livestock industry side of things in a broad sense, this is one of the things that we've got to work to improve. And I know it's difficult not to keep them out there on those droughty kind of years in particular, that extra week, but we need to be thinking about the persistence of stands, and that means that we got to avoid overgrazing. I truly believe that one thing about bird's foot trefoil, if it is not overgrazed, is it can retain really good quality even in a mature state. It can produce seed, so it can propagate by seed production. Let me state that, again, there are certain groups that look at trefoil as being potentially invasive. I'm one that probably don't fall into that particular camp. Yeah, it's a plant in my mind that managed correctly, again, avoiding the overgrazing, that we can defer grazing, let it go to seed, and keep it going in that regard. One of the issues that we did have in Indiana, in southern Indiana, it's a species that doesn't like extreme humidity, and it can get on the get Rhizoctonia disease. But again, I think where it's most adapted would be what I would call the upper Midwest and up into the northeastern U.S.
All right, we had another one come in just in the nick of time asking about interseeding alfalfa in Bermuda grass, you know, where that is grown obviously in the southern tier. Any thoughts on that, potential for that?
Well, again, from the regionality factor, I think that's where I would definitely talk to people that have worked on that system, because they're the ones that are doing it. Bermuda grass is not one that we have much of in Indiana. Probably the greatest acreage is our football stadium here at Purdue University. But there has been work done, and I would encourage to look at it. It does appear, based on what I know about it, that it has given some opportunities. But I would go to the land-grant universities and talk to the extension forage specialist, and if they're not involved with the research, they will know the researchers in that region that can give them the specifics. But I do know there's been some positive things about that.
Yeah, I hail from some of those parts, as does Marty. So maybe I can give some tips to the guy that asked the question. So we'll send him some links in that direction. So thank you to all of our presenters tonight. We really appreciate you guys being on. Thank you again, Marty, for hosting. With that, we'll let everyone have a great night. Stay safe out there, and we'll be talking to you soon on another webinar. Thank you for joining us.